Welcome back for a review of One Piece chapter 1051, and I thought this was overall an excellent chapter. In fact, I thought it was one of the best in the entire Wano story arc. This chapter gives us even more reason to believe that the battle is over, but also suggests that Big Mom and Kaido's stories are not yet finished. But before getting too far into the discussion, let me quickly say welcome to anyone new to the channel. I do weekly One Piece chapter reviews, theory videos, and discussions. So if you're interested, please consider subscribing. It really helps this channel grow, and I really appreciate your support. Okay, so now getting into the discussion, I'm very briefly going to mention the cover story arc where we now see all four Vinsmoke siblings reunited, prepared to escape from Totland. With powerful members of Big Mom's family like Katakuri still present, their escape may not be entirely unimpeded, but I am interested to see where this story takes them after they leave Big Mom's territory. And I may sound like a broken record, but we still don't have confirmation whether or not Reiju and Ichiji were actually the silhouetted invaders on Cacao Island, as much as I think that's most likely the case. Still, there is the possibility that there's another set of invaders currently working their way through Totland. Moving into the actual chapter, we open on the Flower Capital as the Akazaya Samurai step forth from the mist, revealing themselves to the bewildered people of Wano. In fact, the majority of this week's chapter is centered around this scene, though Oda cuts away to two other key moments. Essentially, the entire chapter is focused on Momo addressing the people of Wano at the end of the battle as he prepares to take up his father's mantle, all building toward the double-page spread at the end of the chapter where we finally see his appearance as an adult. I know I'm jumping a bit ahead here, but I wanted to mention this now because I think the slow build-up makes Momo's revelation feel all the more impactful, starting with the silhouetted shadows from Toki's prophecy emerging from the mist in the opening scene, like something right out of a dream. In fact, as the people of Wano watch the Akazaya Samurai emerge from the mist, a woman remarks that Toki's prophecy has now come true, which indicates these figures are indeed the 9 shadows cast by the moon on a night woven of 20 years, who have arrived to deliver Wano's new dawn. Now, I'm still not convinced this represents the complete fulfillment of Toki's prophecy for a couple reasons. First, the dawn itself is something which is arriving first on Wano, but will also be extended to the entire world, so the prophecy would seem to have a double meaning. We don't know exactly how Toki received this prophecy. It's entirely possible based on the quotation marks she was simply reciting a prophecy she heard elsewhere, perhaps recanted by Odin from the Poneglyphs, or something she heard and remembered during the Void Century. All of which is to say it's also possible that just as Wano's liberation is a model for the dawn the entire world will soon witness, the Akazaya Samurai are reflections of the 9 shadows or warriors who will play a similar role on a global scale, perhaps 9Ds for example. Confirming my suspicion from last week, there must have been some passage of time from the end of the battle, as we see the scabbards are already bandaged and recovering from their injuries. Kinemon and Kiku have both seemingly made near full recoveries, which was more sudden than I was expecting. On that note, we see there were indeed 9 people atop Momo's back, including Kinemon, Denjiro, Raizo, Ino Arushi, Nekomamushi, Kiku, Kawamatsu, Hiyori, and Shinobu. In order to make room for Hiyori and Shinobu among the Akazaya 9, Ashura, Doji, and Izo are seemingly absent. The fact that Kinemon and Kiku were bandaged and recovered off-panel, despite the severity of their injuries, makes me wonder whether or not Ashura, Doji, and Izo could actually be dead. I'm not really sure at this point, as it seems it could go either way. On the one hand, Oda is often very reluctant to kill major named characters, so 2 major deaths would be unusual. At the same time, this was a war against 2 Emperors of the Sea, and it would be even stranger for the Alliance not to suffer any casualties. Both were left severely injured, and Izo in particular seemed resigned to sacrifice himself by holding off CP0. He seemed to understand that he was sealing his own fate by challenging them to a fight. Ultimately though, I think the biggest surprise for me is that I expected all 9 to share the same fate one way or the other. I thought all of them would live or all of them would die, and for a while I was actually leaning toward the latter. I was somewhat expecting all 9 could meet their end, as it seemed Kiku's words in chapter 1014 indicated she and the other scabbards would witness Wano's new dawn from the afterlife, alongside Odin and Toki. But as I said, the fact that 9 shadows now stand before the people of Wano, including the previously severely injured Kinemon and Kiku, perhaps doesn't bode so well for the 2 who are presently missing. This is perhaps reflected in the somber looks on the scabbards' faces during this scene. Moving on, we see the people in the capital use light scrolls to broadcast Momo's arrival throughout Wano to the various regions, including Ringo, where we briefly glimpse Onimaru standing among the onlookers. Now, as I said last week, at this point I think the battle is almost certainly over, but I do still entertain the very remote possibility that there's going to be some type of dramatic reemergence for Kaido. And I'm just saying that if that were to happen, it would make more sense with all eyes in the country now on the Flower Capital. Now again, I think it's very unlikely, but it's still interesting to entertain the possibility. I think it's just as often interesting to discuss the what-ifs, or the unlikely alternatives to what seems to be the obvious direction the story is taking. Oda then cuts away back to Onigashima, where the Straw Hats have now regrouped inside the performance hall, where Yamato bluntly introduces herself as the newest crew member. As I said in my review for chapter 1050, at this point I think Yamato is probably going to join the crew. I'm not going to spend too much time on the topic here because I'm going to make a separate video on this subject, but this scene in particular didn't really move the needle one way or the other in my opinion. Now that Momo has aged into an adult, decided to keep the borders closed for the time being, Zunisha is waiting offshore, and the majority of the Akazaya samurai are still alive, I think there are very few barriers remaining for Yamato to join the crew. However, I was a bit surprised at just how plain her introduction was to the rest of the Straw Hats in this week's chapter, which seems a bit odd or a bit false, considering just how long it was delayed. She introduced herself to Luffy almost 80 chapters ago, and although she briefly crossed paths with Frankie, she's just now getting to meet the rest of the Straw Hats after the battle is finished, which makes me wonder why Oda chose to go this direction instead of letting her form organic bonds with them throughout the raid. This is interesting because by comparison, about the same number of chapters passed between Luffy's first meeting with Jinbei on level 6 of Impel Down and the first time he met the rest of the crew on Fishman Island. If Yamato does join, I just wonder what reason there was for this delay considering how relatively straightforward this meeting turned out to be. Nami and Usopp are understandably shocked, Frankie is ready to fight when she says she's Kato's son, Sanji and Brook are unsurprisingly immediately accepting, and Robin laughs. But Jinbei's response is the most interesting, as he tells her that inviting herself is fine, but Luffy has to be the one to make the decision, which to her credit Yamato doesn't refute. So do I think this means Luffy's going to reject Yamato outright? Most likely not, especially considering he said he owes her one when they last spoke atop Onigashima. But I do think this means there needs to be some other development if she's going to be accepted into the crew. As I said last week, I think Yamato now has potential motive for sailing to Laugh Tale, which aligns with her desire to carry on Oden's legacy, by finding the missing information from Oden's journal and delivering an answer to Momo about what role he's meant to play by delivering the New Dawn. But it's odd that Yamato is still referring to herself as Kozuki Oden, and thus I think Luffy may reject Yamato until she stops doing so. Inherited will is one of the most important and recurrent themes throughout the series, but trying to literally be another person is to deny herself as an individual. I think what she needs to understand is that Oden was Oden, and she can be Yamato while still honoring and fighting to build upon his legacy. In a sense, I actually think Yamato's character arc parallels Momonosuke's. He was a young kid forced to grow up very fast and take up his parents' mantle. He essentially never had a childhood. Conversely, Yamato grew up in chains, so even though she's an adult, she's still very childlike. Now, no, I'm not saying she's childish. There's a very big difference. What I mean is, she still has a very wide-eyed perspective of the world, and her framing of what it means to be Oden reminds me very much of a kid playing make-believe. I've also compared this to acting out a part in this kabuki play. Yamato even told Luffy that maybe he was more Oden than she was. Right now, she's playing the part of Oden, but maybe Luffy can have the next turn. However, I think what taking off or passing on this costume of Oden means is exploring who Yamato is as an individual character. As I said, I still think there's much more to explore regarding Yamato and Kaido's backstory, including their Oni or Ogre heritage. So as much as Yamato's goal may be motivated by her reverence for Oden, I think as a crew member, other aspects of her character would likely come to the forefront. Now, could Luffy still reject Yamato as a crew member outright? Sure, maybe that's still a possibility. He could again charge Yamato with looking after Momo until the borders are ready to open, promising to take her with them when they come back to Wano. Yamato did spend most of her panel time in this story arc bonding with Momonosuke. As the scene continues, we even see Yamato force some of Kaido's subordinates to fall back in line, so it's possible her continued presence may be deemed necessary to help prevent her father's army from wreaking havoc. Yamato does possess a devil fruit which makes her a guardian deity of Wano, so perhaps Luffy would want her to help protect the country. I'm not saying these outcomes are likely, but they remain remote possibilities. More likely, it seems she'll be sailing with the Straw Hat Pirates, but as Jinbei said, it's something Luffy will need to confirm, and I think further development is needed first, one way or the other, which isn't exactly uncommon for those who join the crew. Now, though this is unrelated to this week's chapter, I will also add that this really doesn't change anything for Carrot, She and Yamato are entirely separate characters, so even if Yamato does join, it doesn't exclude Carrot or eliminate her chances of joining. I'm going to finally make a dedicated video on this topic very soon, so that's all I'll say for the time being. Moving on, Usopp asks Tama what's going to happen to the gifters she swayed to fight by their side. We here learn that her powers last for 1 lunar cycle, or roughly 1 month. However, she also says that the creatures she sways with her powers sometimes choose to maintain their loyalty even after the effects of her Kibidango expire. Now, this is interesting on a couple levels. First, the effects of her power are tied to the lunar cycle. As I discussed in an earlier video, I came across an interesting theory that Tama's Kibidango are meant to look like the full moon, which could be significant given the importance of the moon as a symbol of hope seen throughout the series. The second point, which is even more interesting, is that the creatures swayed by the fruit's power may remain friends with the fruit's wielder even after the effects expire. Tama speculates that the animal chooses what makes them the happiest, which could potentially have some pretty big implications regarding Zunisha. We know Zunisha can only act according to Momo's command, but we don't really know why this is the case. We did receive confirmation that Zunisha was cursed 800 years ago, so perhaps it was swayed by whoever wielded Tama's power during the Void Century. This could explain why the fruit was on Wano, perhaps guarded as a treasure in the Flower Capital. Zunisha certainly seems remorseful for whatever crime it was said to have committed, so perhaps it chose to remain under the fruit's power for all these centuries in penance for its great crime, just as Tama suggested is possible. Now, the question of exactly who wielded this power during the Void Century remains a mystery, but they likely had an important connection to Joy Boy. In any case, Tama says she hopes Speed chooses to remain by her side, but as a mother rather than as a servant, which was certainly a touching moment, especially considering what we learn about Tama's childhood in this week's chapter. This also leads me to believe that most of the prominent and goofy gifters will remain with Tama even if some later revolt. Undoubtedly, they must be happier serving Tama than they would have been under Kaido. Nami has always had a soft spot when it comes to taking care of and protecting children, which we have seen throughout the Wano story arc, particularly on Onigashima with Tama, and I suppose Speed could now fill the role of mother in Tama's life as she seemed genuinely moved by Tama's words. This scene could also eliminate whatever small chance remained for Tama to join the Straw Hats, which I never thought was particularly likely, but it did seem Nami had a motherly bond with Tama. But now that Tama has assigned that role to Speed, and potentially has an army of Smile as her friends, I think she's pretty much certain to remain behind, which I personally think is fitting. As much as Tama is a great character and has a close bond with the crew, she's still 8 years old, and she deserves to have a childhood. She said in chapter 1004 that what she wants most is to live in a Wano where there's enough food to eat and Momo is the Shogun, and that wish was fulfilled in this week's chapter. Tama may indeed set sail someday, perhaps even as a pirate, but I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. Again, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but a few pages later we see a brief flashback for Tama, which likely takes place around 4 years before the present, given the established timing of Ace's arrival on Wano. We here learn that her parents were seemingly worked to death in one of Kaido and Orochi's labor camps, which adds yet another layer of tragedy to Tama's character. One noteworthy detail here is that it seems Komichio was already by her side, but this doesn't necessarily mean she was already in possession of her devil fruit, as he could have simply been her pet. The markings on the graves aren't really legible, but the fact that her parents were slaves likely indicates they weren't part of the Kurozumi clan. Otherwise, it's unclear why Orochi would have enslaved them. As I've been saying, I think the persecution of the Kurozumi, which contributed to the creation of monsters like Orochi and Kanjuro, needs to be addressed before the arc concludes, and I thought Tama could help symbolize the breaking of that cycle, as there was seemingly good evidence she could have been a Kurozumi. It seems for now that theory might be disproven, but again, without being able to read the grave markers, it's impossible to say for certain. We next see Tama's first meeting with Tenguyama Hitetsu, during which he tells her to take heart, knowing just a few short years remain before the return of the Kozuki to set Wano free. This makes her response to Momo's speech all the more moving, but it's also curious, Hitetsu refers to the Kozuki vanquishing the ogres for good. As I've been saying, even if the battle has concluded, I still think Kaido's backstory and the history of the ogres is very important, and will be later revisited. But it seems Hitetsu's promise has finally come to pass, as the Kozuki have indeed returned. And this brings us to the final scene in this week's chapter. As the mist clears, adult Momo's silhouette appears, and he then addresses the entire nation for the first time as its new shogun. He assures his people that all of their enemies, including Kaido, Orochi, and the Beast Pirates, have been vanquished, and he enumerates the ways Wano will be transformed for the better in the wake of this victory. His words were genuinely touching, and I really appreciated Oda highlighting the special bond between Momo and Kinemon, as well as the fact that Momo is still young and insecure, as he whispered that he'd run out of things to say. As Kinemon suggested, his bluff was certainly successful in garnering his people's support, It's notable that these Straw Hats were absent for this moment of triumph, and instead remained hidden away in Onigashima. Momo referred to the allies he gathered at sea, and highlighted the importance of the Pirate Mink Samurai Alliance in vanquishing Kaido. But this scene drove home a very important point, that although these Straw Hats are the central protagonists of the series as a whole, and will bring the dawn to the entire world, this story saga ultimately belongs to Momo. His character arc has been the driving force. In a way, this reframes my perspective on Luffy's victory against Kaido during this current battle. I stand by my assertion that Kaido hasn't been supplanted as the world's strongest creature, that there's more of his story yet to be told, and that the true nature and importance of his devil fruit haven't yet been revealed. But previously, I suggested that the manner in which Luffy achieved victory should highlight the qualities which make him fit to be Joy Boy. Kaido's faulty perception is that strength alone is what qualifies a person to lead, to transform the world. Accordingly, he wanted to create a world of constant war, where survival of the fittest reigns as the governing principle. But Luffy's greatest strength is his ability to form bonds of fellowship wherever he goes, and this is the main reason I thought Luffy would require allies to help him overcome Kaido, to prove that his strength is rooted in shouldering the dreams and visions of others. But interestingly, I think this chapter reframes things, in that ultimately Momo, who also possesses these attributes, is the one responsible for taking down Kaido. This story saga pit the world's so-called strongest living creature against a helpless 8-year-old child. But as the narrator says, what Momo lacks in strength, he makes up for in dedication and mercy. Momo lost his parents, he traveled through time, set out to sea, and surrendered his childhood, and through this odyssey recruited the allies needed to liberate his homeland. This victory isn't Luffy's, but Momo's, and that's the reason Luffy's victory wasn't witnessed by the people of Wano. It's the reason he's not part of this celebration. It's the reason he's not being praised like Lucy at the end of Dressrosa. Luffy may have been the hero Wano deserved, but Momo is the hero they need right now. Luffy was carrying the dreams of Wano and the wishes of its shogun Momonosuke as he defeated Kaido. He was simply the instrument used to bring about Kaido's downfall. He willingly became a soldier in this war, led into battle by Momonosuke, who took on the role of both shogun and general. While Momo wasn't primarily a combatant, he consistently demonstrated his bravery and against all odds led the forces he recruited to victory. While I still think the actual battle between Luffy and Kaido resolved rather suddenly, and that Kaido is bound to someday re-emerge, if not now then in the future, I do think Momo's character arc has been very well written, and fittingly the chapter concludes with him making his first full appearance on panel as an adult. And I have to say I really like his design. As Shinobu indicated, he shares many facial features with Oden, but I'm happy to see his appearance is still very unique. I'm glad Oda chose not to make him an exact clone or replica of his father, as I suspect we will see much more of Momo in the future. Now, a few more details before I close this review. First, as Momo addresses those who were lost or sacrificed their lives for the sake of bringing about this victory, Oda cuts to reaction panels from Carrot and Toko, and I'm happy to see Oda is still emphasizing the weight of Pedro's death. Again, I think processing this loss is going to continue to be an important force driving Carrot's character arc as she moves forward, but as I said, that's a topic for an upcoming video. Lastly, in the final panel, we see Momo and his retainers prepare to enter the Shogun's castle, surrounded by cherry blossoms drifting through the night sky. It may be significant that Oda chose not to end the third act on this scene, and that the dawn itself hasn't yet risen. This could indicate that though the battle has almost certainly concluded, there may yet be another major development before the dawn arrives and the third act concludes. It's also interesting to note that Momo is now wielding his father's second sword, Ame no Habakiri, famous for slaying the Yamato no Orochi of legend. As I said last week, I still think it's possible Orochi may slither away from the rebel and could envision a final confrontation between Momo and Wano's deposed shogun, now that his army has been decimated and Wano has been taken from his control. Perhaps this confrontation could at last address and resolve both the Kurozumi grudge and the cyclic nature of this conflict. The narrator says this scene marks the birth of a man who will someday be known far and wide as the great shogun of Wano, Kozuki Momonosuke. I think this scene in particular really resonated, and reinforces the idea that Momo will continue to be a major force in the story moving forward. I suspect we'll see him go through a rapid training arc, like Kobe and Helmeppo, and that by the end of the series, he could truly become one of the world's strongest. In any case, I think this scene really drives home the point that Momo was meant to play an incredibly important role in the endgame of the series. This entire 10-year story saga has really been centered around his character arc, and has culminated in this moment with him rising to become Wano's new shogun. In last week's review, I said that though I felt the battle between Luffy and Kaido ended abruptly, I still think Kaido's role in the story hasn't yet been resolved. I suggested the fact that Wano's borders haven't opened means some elements of Wano's story arc may remain intentionally unresolved for the time being. But to clarify, I still think we're going to see resolution for many of the lingering narrative threads during the following action, which may be contained to a fourth act. But the actual opening of the borders could be an event which follows discovery of One Piece, much like the impending destruction of Fishman Island. And as such, I wonder if this could mean that some elements of Wano's story arc could be building toward a future battle on this island. I even wonder if this could suggest a future battle between Momonosuke and Kaido directly, if the latter's desire to control Wano persists despite his forces and infrastructure being decimated. This is what I mean when I say Kaido's ambition could persist despite his loss to Luffy. Kaido has already been defeated 7 times, and that hasn't deterred his interest in possessing the land of Wano and creating a world of war. If Kaido is not dead, then his desire to achieve a great warrior's death remains unfulfilled, and we know a world war is coming. All that is to say, though Kaido's role here and now might be concluded, I still think his story will go on. It's very interesting Oda hasn't shown us Big Mom and Kaido after the volcanic eruption from chapter 1050. This could imply the 2 fallen emperors were indeed incinerated and killed unceremoniously off-panel, but I still believe that's rather unlikely. Not only is that unlike Oda's usual writing style, both of them have unresolved storylines. I'm not suggesting Kaido is going to get right back up and continue the fight at this point, particularly with the entire alliance exhausted, as it would undercut the weight of Momo's speech in this chapter and undermine the trust he has just earned from his people. He just promised them that Kaido and Orochi are defeated, and if Kaido stands back up, that reflects very poorly on Wano's new Shogun. But I also think this means Big Mom and Kaido's stories are bound to continue in some form, but it remains unclear where and when the emperors will strike back. Anyway, that's all for this week's chapter review. Thank you for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a like. If you want to be notified when future videos are posted, please consider subscribing. It really helps this channel grow, and I really appreciate your support. But most important, what did you think about this week's chapter? What do you think about this being the conclusion to the Wano story arc? Make sure you let me know your thoughts down in the comments.